Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight for what's going to be hopefully an interesting talk on big data, privacy, and the upcoming field of computational privacy. Before I start going into the science, let me tell you about a little story. So I don't know if you guys know CSI, the crime drama television series. Who knows it? Not too bad. So that's the kind of show that we at Imperial love. And I'm sure you guys too. Scientists saving the world with near magical powers. However, in one of my favorite episodes, it's like a Derek episode. They know from the very beginning who the bad guy, who the killer is. But they don't know how to prove it. And then the way it happened is basically someone got killed, and in the apartment, when they found the body, they just collected fingerprints from all over the apartment, on knives, on walls, in the bathroom. And basically what they want to do is they want to be able to prove that this guy is actually the killer. So what they do is they have an agent basically follow him around. And at some point, he enters a bar. And like every good James Bond villain, he orders a whiskey in a crystal glass, sits in a leather couch, and then starts discussing and watching the crowd. However, at some point, he gets tired of it and then moves on to, its next stop. And that's the time in which basically the agent just runs and grabs the glass and brings it back to the lab for analysis. Basically, what they do there is they collect the fingerprint from the glass on a little, piece of plastic paper. They enter it in the scanner and they scan it. They scan it and then they look in the computer, and what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to compare it to the database of fingerprints that they collected in the apartment. I mean, the guy has been pretending that he doesn't know the victim. He has never been in the apartment. So if they can actually place him in the apartment, that's going to be sufficient evidence to arrest and prosecute him. And what they do is they enter the fingerprint and then they start comparing against the database. And that's that's the moment you wonder what's going to happen. You wait a little bit, you see things happening on the screen, and you wait and you wait and you wait. And at some point, here it is. It's a match. They can actually arrest and prosecute the guy. However, when you think about it, it's not that easy, right? If you're going to arrest, prosecute, and hopefully put someone in jail, you better be really, really sure that the fingerprint that you collected from the glass belongs to the same person than the fingerprints you collected in the apartment. And for that, the CSI team should thank this guy, Edmond Lecard. Edmond Lecard is a Frenchman who in the 1930s wrote a book called Traité de criminalistique, l'épreuve de l'identité. And basically what he did in this book is that he showed that, on average, to compare two fingerprints, all you need are 12 points. And I represent them here as points on a fingerprint, but actually what they are distances between ridges. You take a fingerprint, you look at the image, and then you try to compute the distances between some of the ridges. And that's how you're going to compare two images. And actually, he was able to show that all CSI results need to actually arrest and prosecute the guy is for these 12 distances to be close enough to one another. And since then, fingerprint is used extensively to find and identify people, not only in TV shows. However, we're leaving behind a lot more traces than just fingerprints. You go running with your phone on to try to be able to see how fast you've been running and to be able to compare with your friends, allowing you to generate these kind of visualizations of people running around in Washington, D.C. You use your phone. Every time you make a phone call, you receive a text. Generates one of those lines in a carrier's database. Every time you go on a search engine and you search for something, and any link you click generates yet another of those lines. Every time you go to a shop and you swipe your credit card to buy something, another one of those lines. And, you know, what's really interesting is that there's a threshold, but at some point, there's always a threshold on which people start to get worried. You start to find all of this data being collected and used creepy, one way or the other. And what's particularly interesting for me as an academic and as a researcher is that every time you bring that up, very often you hear the exact same answer, like what we got here in London with the TfL. So basically, this is one thing that the TfL has been doing in London. It's like, you know, they have a Wi-Fi network so that you have Wi-Fi when you're actually riding the subway. And basically what they do is that every time your phone connects to one of those, like, you know, Wi-Fi access point, or just passes by one of those Wi-Fi access point, the time and the MAC address of your phone gets recorded. And again, this is another example like what I showed you before, which is like, you know, it's good, and there's a lot of good things that you can do with this data, yet at some point you might find this a bit creepy. And this is where the magic answers comes. You shouldn't really worry. As we've been explained, this is anonymous information. And if anonymous is not clear enough to you, they explain to you that the data collected was depersonalized, whatever that means, so that no individual could be identified. Again, if you're worried, if you find this a bit creepy, this might be too much, you shouldn't worry. Data's anonymous. It's depersonalized. And then you can keep searching the internet and reading news articles about data brokers or others, in which, again, you should not worry. The data is anonymous. This is another example from my home country of Belgium, in which the city of Antwerp is basically using mobile phone data to look at how people are cycling, driving, walking around the city. And then you have very nice, like, you know, reassuring statements from the mayor of the city, Bart de Wever. Basically says, again, same kind of rationale that basically says, you know, we're just tracking the signal, so it's not even a phone, it's tracking the signal. And we don't know whose mobile it is. The data's anonymous. Why do you guys worry? So the question me and my research group at Imperial really wanted to answer is this true? Can data really be collected and used anonymously? Or, like we've seen in the little, like, you know, CSI TV show, is the way we behave as unique as our fingerprint? Is the way you and I walk around, shop, search for things online, very quickly makes us very unique, unique enough to re-identify us. So to answer that question, we proposed a metric called Jeannie City. And basically here, what we're trying to do is to take a statistical approach. It's to see, you know, what would it take? How difficult would it be to uniquely re-identify someone in one of those anonymous databases? What do I need? So let's say I have a database like the one I showed you before, mobile phone data, and I know that one person, Scott, friend of mine, is in the database. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this database and try to see if I can find which traces in the database is Scott's. And to do that, I would use points. So for fingerprints, points were distances between ridges. In this case, point would be a place and a time. Any information that allows me to know that Scott was at a given place at a given time. And then the question is going to be, how many of these points do I need to know so that in my entire database of mobile phone data, there's one and only one person that was at those places at those times. And if I find one and only one person, this has to be Scott. So let's make a quick poll. When we were talking about offline, physical fingerprints were leaving behind, we needed 12 points, 12 of these distances between ridges. How many points do you guys think I need? A place, 1 kilometer square, and a time between 10 and 11 a.m. to be able to uniquely identify Scott. So let's do a quick poll. Who think that we need 12 points or more? Online is, similar to offline. It's not better, not worse, more or less 12 points. Okay? Who think that we need 10 points? 8? 6? Okay, more hands. 4? A lot more hands. 3? 2? Okay, for those who have not been voting yet, this is going to be your last chance. 1? No? Who's left? Okay, couple. I mean, why don't we try? We have the database, and I know a person that is in this, who is in this database. So basically, what we do is we start with the entire database, like all of people moving around. This is Boston, like 8 million people moving around all the time. And basically what I do is every point, every piece of information I know about Scott, I know that he has to be there. So I can remove everyone in the database that is not at this place at this time or around that place around that time. And as you can see, what's really interesting is I can do it 1 time, I can do it 2 times, I could do it 3 times. And very quickly, even if you start with a large-scale database, millions of people, you go down 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, and very quickly, all you need is a 4th point. Knowing that Scott was, up here towards the end of the day. So that out of all of the traces in the database, there is one and only one that was at those 4 places at those 4 times. And therefore is Scott, allowing me to uniquely re-identify him and then following around in the full database. So this is just a video for you guys to get a sense of what we've been doing. But actually, we did the research. Took a large-scale database in a European country, 15 months, for 1.5 million people. And what we showed is that knowing 4 points on average is enough to uniquely identify someone 95% of the time. 95% of the time in a database of 1.5 million people over 15 months is enough to uniquely identify someone. Meaning, I have the database, I know Scott, I'm searching for him 95% of the time. This is all I need. So, where would I get those points from? Well, I know Scott. I know where he lives. I know where he works. If I know become a bit creepy or even creepier, I could follow him around. Or I can just stay, behind my computer and search for information about him online, stuff he would have, left behind. Geolocated tweets. Not the precise, GPS coordinate, just the fact that, you were in this neighborhood of Copenhagen this evening. I could look at, his Instagram account, any geolocated pictures that allows me to know that he was there at a point, at a time. can go even further. I could look for, reviews that he left online. Like the fact, this is the Foursquare account of a friend of mine, all public, and which basically left 100 of those restaurant reviews, allowing me that, that evening, he was at this restaurant. That, on January 4th, he was in this restaurant, L'Alsace in Paris, where he got oysters that apparently were really good, but, as often in Paris, overpriced. And what's actually really interesting is you can go even further here, which is sure, it's a place and a time. But especially when you go to the restaurant, there's another thing beyond carrying their phone that people have a tendency to do. How do you pay? How do you pay for this restaurant? Cash or credit card? And what's actually really interesting is in America, 70% of the time, people pay by credit card. Which means that if I look at this feed, and these 100 places where he has been going to, 70% of the time, he would have paid for this restaurant using his credit card. Which allows us to play the exact same game. And we did it. Large-scale credit card database. In this case, OECD country. 1.1 million people over 3 months. And basically what we showed is, again, very few pieces of information are enough to uniquely identify someone. In this case, 4 of them, a shop and a day, is enough to uniquely identify someone 90% of the time. 90% of the time, you're the only person that will successively have gone to those 4 shops on those 4 days. Out of the 100 tips that he left publicly available online, 4 of those are enough on average to uniquely identify him. So let's go back to our problem. Data is being collected, and we're being told that the data is anonymous, that we should not worry. At least at this point, I hope I convinced you that pseudonymizing it, the fact that there is no name, no phone numbers, no addresses, no credit card numbers associated with this data is probably not sufficient to reassure you. It's probably not sufficient to convince you that the data is truly anonymous. So what do we do? Well, that's where the de-identification or depersonalization suddenly kicks in, with very nice analogies. So you all know about pictures, right? And in TV shows or suddenly pictures are blurred and so on and so forth. Well, one way you could try to truly anonymize this data to try to prevent me from playing this little game of taking a database and trying to find Scott would be to add noise, right? If I take this picture and then I add more and more noise, at some point you will not be able to re-identify him, right? What do you think? Yes? No? Great. So let's do the same thing. Let's do the same thing with mobile phone data, right? We take the data is reasonably precise, and then we can just add noise. And if I add enough noise, I will be able to prevent my team from re-identifying me in the data. Exact same idea. And beyond every single technique that you hear about for anonymizing or de-identifying data is the idea of adding noise. Trying to hide you in the crowd, trying to prevent someone from being able to uniquely re-identify you. Well, it sounds like a great idea, and it works with images. Actually, what we did is we tried to do the same thing with mobile phone data, and this is the only equation I have in my entire talk, I promise. Still a science talk, so it might still be okay, but bear with me, it's really important. So basically what this equation tells you are three things. One good news, two bad news. The good news is your intuition was partially right. If you take the data and you make it less precise, it is going to be harder for me to uniquely re-identify you. If you decrease the spatial or the temporal resolution of the data, making the data less precise, it's going to be harder. The V and the H. However, first bad news. Turns out that it gets harder, but only marginally harder. This is what economists would refer to as decreasing returns. Basically, every time you try to gain privacy, you try to decrease the likelihood of re-identification by adding noise, it gets harder and harder. If you want to gain 3% privacy, you want to decrease the risk by 3%, you need to go from 1 kilometer square, the resolution, to 2 kilometers square. And then if you want to gain another 3%, you need to go from 2 kilometers squares to 4 kilometers square. And then if you want to gain another 3%, you need to go from 4 to 8. Which basically means that, sure, it makes you feel good, it seems to make sense, it works with images, but at the end of the day, it helps a little bit at the beginning, but very quickly you get decreasing return. It does not actually help and prevent re-identification. And this is where the third bad news comes in. Third piece of information, second bad news. It's little p in the exponent. And basically what this tells you is that at the end of the day, you can try to decrease the likelihood of re-identification by adding noise, but it's just going to be a question for me and my team to collect a few more pieces of information. It's not going to be 4 points, it's going to be 5, it's going to be 6, it's going to be 7. Just a couple more of these pieces of information to again be able to uniquely re-identify you with high likelihood. Even the data that is extremely imprecise, like 15 kilometer squares with like a temporal resolution of 15 hours, if I know 10 points, 10 places and times where you were, that is sufficient to uniquely re-identify you with more than 50% of the time. So what's interesting here is that, data is being collected. There is no name, no credit card, no addresses. Not sufficient. You can try to add noise. You can try to hide someone in the crowd and then hope for the best. Fortunately, what this tells you is that the idea sounds good, and at the beginning it helps a little bit. Very quickly, you can again uniquely re-identify someone. So what do we do? What do we have left? And what's very interesting is that very quickly it comes down to this argument. Well, the data is being collected, it's not really anonymous, but at the end of the day, I'm not doing anything wrong, right? I mean, who here has been doing something wrong? Right? Some of you, good. I would be disappointed. Or, it comes down to, you have nothing to hide. Why do you worry? Right? I mean, you've been using your phone and you've buying shit online. It's okay, right? Nothing wrong. You know what you've been doing. You know how you've been moving around. At the end of the day, it's not that sensitive, right? It's a place and a time where you were. Maybe it's actually okay. And so one thing we wanted to do to really try to help people understand both the sensitivity of the data and the way this data can be used is a little experiment that we've been running at MIT. Basically, we took 100 undergraduate students We give them free phones in exchange for their data. So if you ever wonder, like, if everyone comes to you and is like, oh, how much is my data worth, and so on and so forth, well, if you're like, a starving undergraduate at MIT, it turns out that the $600 phone is all of your data for a year. But basically what we did is, like, we gave them the phone and collected the data. And then we asked them to answer this little questionnaire. 30 questions. Do you see yourself as someone who's talkative, full of energy, you're doing things efficiently, you get nervous easily? And basically what's really interesting is that if you answer these 30 questions, it allows me to describe your personality along those 5 axes. For those of you who have been following the whole, Cambridge Analytica, scandal/shit show, this is the kind of information that they were trying to predict about you to then influence votes. Basically what this is this is the Big Five, the ocean model. So basically, by having you answering those questions, it allows me to say and to predict where you are on this axis, and to say, okay, this is what your degree of neuroticism is. Are you someone who's pretty low, medium, or high on the neuroticism scale? Are you someone who's low, medium, or high on the openness scale? And really, along those 5 axes, that is one of the best models that exist, coming from psychology, to describe someone's personality. Then what we did is, we took the mobile phone, and then we looked at what exists in your mobile phone data that might tell me something about your personality. I'm not looking at your calls, I'm not looking at what you've been texting, or I'm not even looking at who you've been texting. I'm just looking at the way you've been using your phone. Basic things like, oh, this is the amount of time you spend calling. This is the amount of time you spend texting. Are you more of a calling person or more of a texting person? How much time total are you spending on the phone per month, and things like that. And then we went into slightly more subtle ones. For example, you just received a text. How much time is it going to take you to answer that text? Are you the kind of person who's probably a bit neurotic, your phone is always within a meter from you, and everyone who knows you knows that, within 30 seconds to 45 seconds, they will get an answer to this text? Or are you the kind of more free-minded scientist that has the habit of losing their phone pretty much everywhere, and then basically at the end of the day, suddenly there's 45 of those text, and then suddenly you start answering everyone. We're going to look at the way you've been moving around. Are you someone who goes basically every single day at the exact same time from home to work and work to home? Maybe stopping by the grocery shop. Or are you someone who basically has much more erratic schedule, and then tends to go explore the city and go see what's going on, go to a concert here, or an event there, come here tonight? And basically what we did with my team is we developed more than 1,400 of these indicators, of these behavioral indicators. Anything that we can extract from mobile phone data that might tell me something about your personality. And then what we did is, we have the data, and we have the personality of the students. And we wanted to see the extent to which, by just looking at the phone, does that tell me something about their personality? And basically what we showed is that using machine learning algorithm, we could predict fairly well people's personality simply from the way they've been using their phone. Only by looking at the way you text and call, not the content, not what you've been saying on the phone, we can predict people's personality, their degree of neuroticism, whether they're low, medium, or high on the neuroticism scale, up to 1.7 times better than random. just by looking at this data and computing those indicators, we can predict whether someone is low, medium, or high on the openness scale with 61% accuracy. So, going back to our original question is, data has been collected. There is no names, not sufficient. We're going to add noise. We're going to depersonalize it. Not sufficient. Very quickly, the way you behave is unique enough. Data is not sensitive. You have nothing to hide. Well, turns out that really when it comes to large-scale behavioral data sets, sensitive is not just, places and times where you've been, right? It's like your Facebook data. It's what this data will predict and reveal about you now or in the future when used at large scale by machine learning algorithms. So where do we go from here? Should we make data collection illegal? Should we all learn to carry a metal box and have our phone in the metal box all the time with us in a backpack? Should we stop? Should we pay cash always? Should we stop using the internet? Well, honestly, I don't think so. Right? There are a lot of excellent use cases of this data. And there are scientists, including here in Denmark, who are using this data for good, who are using this data to try to study and understand human behavior and society. There are amazing uses of this data in developing countries, where mobile phone data is being used to try to, aggregated data, try to understand where people are going after a natural disaster, where people are using mobile phone data, and when first responders arrive after an earthquake, are telling them, okay, this is where the vulnerable populations are. If you have resources, this is where you should be sending those resources. There are applications of this data in epidemiology, when basically you're trying to see the extent to which understanding how people are moving around the country, carrying diseases with them, allows you to design better prevention mechanism, try to reduce the number of people who are going to get infected and potentially ultimately die. This data is being used to do poverty mapping. Again, try to understand where are the poorest of the poorest in developing countries and the extent to which you can help them and prioritize resources. So really, very fundamentally, it is sensitive. But there are a lot of good cases. So what do we do? Basically, what we really argue here is, the current privacy utility trade-off that everyone talks about, at the moment, pretty much looks like this. You can always invent a slightly better algorithm, a slightly better method to try to protect privacy. But at the end of the day, it's one or the other. Either you can use the data or you can protect privacy. There is no such thing as, shade of grays of anonymization or risk-based methods. If your way to protect privacy is to take the data, try to modify it, add noise, and modify it enough that you're going to protect people's privacy, either you won't be able to do anything with this data, or you're not actually protecting people's privacy. So what we were arguing, really moving forward, is that we need to reinvent the way we protect privacy and use data. We need to reinvent what this trade-off looks like. And what we're proposing, and what a lot of the research of my group at Imperial College focuses on, is how do we find a better trade-off? How do we find a way in which we can actually provide a balance, provide an acceptable trade-off? And a lot of what we've been working has been along those lines. Is first, we're going to keep the premise. Your data will be used anonymously. Does not mean that the data is anonymous. Your data will be used anonymously. And instead of, taking the data set, scrambling it, add noise, try to do bag of tricks to try to make it harder to re-identify someone, we're going to try to design serious computer science security mechanisms to protect the data, protect access to the data, control access to the data. And this is something that we call Opal. It's basically a big project that's been funded by the French Development Agency, where the goal is really to try to see the extent to which we can make large-scale mobile phone data available for good in developing countries in a way that truly preserves the privacy of the individuals. And it doesn't preserve the privacy of the individuals because some expert came and said, this is so much noise you need to add, and this is probably okay, and it's not that sensitive. We actually spend, years developing mechanisms to allow national statistical offices to use this data while preserving people's privacy. I won't go into too many details, but in short, we're relying on what we call a question and answer mechanism. It's we're not giving you a copy of the data. We're not giving you access to one person's data. We're allowing you to come with a question in the form of open code. We take that piece of code and we validate that piece of code. The community validates that piece of code. And then that piece of code is going to be run on every single person's data individually. Rerun it. Then we aggregate. We add a certain amount of noise. We record the fact that you've been asking that question. And then we send it back to the National Statistical Office. So if you want to know, how many people are going from place A to place B in Copenhagen, we're not giving you a copy of the data of every single person in Copenhagen. I think around 2 million people have been moving around. You come with a question. You're like, I want to know how many people have been going from place A to place B. And then we come back to you with an answer. We record everything. Everything is transparent. Everything can be reviewed by the community. The data is in the hands of the individuals. And this data can be used for good, but in an open, transparent, and secure manner. As Ken Cukier from The Economist said, not using data is like burning books. We do have a moral responsibility, especially as scientists, to use this data and use this data for good. But we also have fundamental human rights, and privacy is one of them. And really, moving forward, I really do think that the only way we're going to be able to find this balance, use the data for good, while protecting people's privacy, is through those question and answer systems. Now we need to develop and deploy a lot more of those and try to truly use big data for good in a way that preserves people's privacy. Thank you.